This is the Dollemore Daily.
Hi, I'm Mike Griner from the Democratic Activist channel, sitting in for Jesse while he's completing his move from California to DC so he can better cover the Washington scene. I want to thank, by the way, all of Jesse's fans who checked out my channel, which is down below. And if you like what you're seeing while I'm sitting in, hopefully you'll join them as well. In the meantime, even though Jesse will be back in a few days, the news never stops. So let's talk politics. And the big news is that Joe Biden gave a speech yesterday in which he gave one of the most full-throated calls for voting rights legislation to pass. For the first time, he called for the Senate to actually cut an exception into the filibuster to allow voting rights legislation to pass. Let's check it out here.
Pass the Freedom to Vote Act. Pass it now, which will prevent voter suppression. Not a single Republican has displayed the courage to stand up to a defeated president to protect America's right to vote. Not one. We have no option but to change the Senate rules, including getting rid of the filibuster for this. Hear me plainly. The battle for the soul of America is not over. We must stand strong and stand together to make sure January 6th marks not the end of democracy, but the beginning of a renaissance of our democracy.
People like me have been calling on Joe Biden to really get involved in this effort for a long time. Our only hope is that this speech that he gave is not too little too late. After all, given the historical performance of the party that's in power, the odds of the Democrats holding on to both the House and the Senate in the next election are certainly less than 50-50. That being said, we've got 3 pieces of legislation, all of which have passed the House. And our hope is that some of them might actually be able to pass the Senate. For example, you've got the Freedom to Vote Act, which includes things like voting by mail, making Election Day a holiday, and requiring states to determine legislative districts with independent, nonpartisan commissions. This legislation, of course, is being filibustered by Republicans, as most of these pieces of legislation are. And it goes directly counter to what the Republicans have been doing in several states. The hope is, though, that this is legislation that actually Joe Manchin is a co-sponsor of, and he was directly involved in negotiating. Manchin, of course, you have to remember, is the former Secretary of State of West Virginia, so he's very familiar with voting rights and voting issues. As a result, my hope is if there's any one of these pieces of legislation that Manchin and his fellow problem child Kyrsten Sinema will agree to carve at least some exception to the filibuster, or at least limit the filibuster in some way to allow it to pass, this is the one. Other pieces of legislation you have are the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. This piece of legislation, of course, is named in memory of John Lewis, the former member of Congress, who was severely beaten while he was marching with Martin Luther King for voting rights. This law would allow the federal government to essentially review state action against voting rights that could be discriminatory. Essentially what it does is it steps in to the holes of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that have been created by recent Supreme Court decisions. This legislation actually is supported by a Republican, including Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska. What's more is similar legislation to this has passed on a bipartisan basis in the past. That being said, it's likely to face a filibuster again, so we'll see if Democrats can get that one through Congress. Finally, the 3 pieces of legislation, the one that's most likely to pass is a revision in the Electoral Count Act. This is the legislation that would address the problem we had on January 6th, where Vice President Pence found himself in this situation where people were demanding that he somehow ignore the will of the people in the election and give the election to Donald Trump. People, of course, being Donald Trump and his supporters. Interestingly, Mitch McConnell specifically said that this is the kind of legislation that Republicans could support. We can't be fooled by Mitch McConnell, though. What he's trying to do, though, is undermine support for the other pieces of legislation, which is really what Republicans are afraid of. This legislation is especially important now in light of the aggressive gerrymandering that Republicans are engaging in the states that they control. Ironically, Democrats don't really have a lot of leeway to do that because in many of the states where they might actually have the opportunity to do some gerrymandering, they've supported the creation of independent, nonpartisan commissions which have put together fair maps rather than the blatantly partisan ones we're seeing in Republican states. In fact, if you're interested, I did another video on it that I'll link to over here. We just heard, by the way, that a North Carolina court is allowing the highly partisan North Carolina gerrymandering map to go into effect. Now, before you get too concerned, remember, this is a lower court, a court that's dominated by Republicans. And it's clear that the parties intend to appeal up to the Supreme Court, where actually Democrats have a slight majority. In the past, the North Carolina Supreme Court has actually struck down gerrymandered maps as being unlawful under the North Carolina Constitution. It's my hope that we'll see that happen again. Either way, if we're sitting here hoping that courts are going to step in to save us, that hope is probably fruitless. Because after all, the U.S. Supreme Court has stepped in and basically completely gutted the Voting Rights Act. What's more is the Supreme Court has said that basically states can gerrymander as much as they want. So if anything's going to happen, it's going to happen on the basis of state laws in the few places that you actually have balanced courts. Now, I know that some people have been frustrated with President Biden, perceiving him as being ineffective at getting done what needs to get done. And I got to tell you, I share those frustrations. But the reality of the matter is, the problem is not Joe Biden. And in fact, the problem is not most of the Democrats. The problem is simply Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. End of story. And of course, the Republicans. We can't forget about them. Because simply, if they were the least bit reasonable, none of this would be an issue anyway. But the reality is that we need every single Democrat to vote along with the party line. And if a single one defects, well, the legislation is not going to pass. This is the problem that President Biden found himself in with the Build Back Better bill, when Joe Manchin announced that he was not in favor of the large price tag that was being put forward for it. Now, I don't think that the Build Back Better bill is necessarily dead. I think we're going to see a lot of its provisions passed over the next year. But that being said, the greatest power that President Biden has is the bully pulpit, as Theodore Roosevelt once said. What President Biden could do is go out and talk to the people and create a groundswell of support, which will then be the kind of thing that pushes senators to do the right thing and pass the voting rights legislation that America desperately needs if we're going to keep our democracy. Well, if you agree with me or disagree with me, I'd love to see your comments down below. And if you could check out my channel, Democratic Activist, I'd sure appreciate it. Again, a special call out to those of you who've already checked out my channel. I really appreciate it. I'll see you in the next video. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.